Today, I'll give you your study plan to go from the B2 level of English up to the C1 and eventually the C2 levels of English. I'm a native English speaker and I've helped a lot of people learn English over the years. And I can tell you that going from the upper intermediate level to the advanced levels of English is a lot more complicated than going from the beginner levels to the intermediate levels of English. Today, I'll tell you everything you need to know to get your skills up to the C2 level of English for all of the 6 essential skills in English being vocabulary, grammar, reading, listening, writing, and speaking. The best part is that all of the methods that I will talk about in today's video have been tested and have been proven to work throughout history. I've also seen them work with basically all of my students in the past with my own 2 eyes, so I know that they will most likely work for you too. First of all, let's look at what it actually means to be at the B2, C1, and C2 levels of English in a general sense. At the B2 level of English, you should be able to communicate about most topics. At the C1 level, you should be able to express yourself about any topic, even if it's more abstract. And at the C2 level of English, you should be fully proficient and be able to communicate spontaneously and fluently about anything. Now, just keep in mind that most native English speakers are not even at the C2 level of English. I would say most native English speakers are a little bit higher than the C1 level of English and a little bit lower than the C2 level of English. Also, depending on age and their educational background, a lot of native English speakers also communicate around the B2 level of English in some cases. So, to be honest, I would only recommend pursuing the C2 level of English if you just really love the English language and want to learn it to your maximum capacity, or if you actually want to teach the English language to other people, whether that be a family member of yours, whether you want to become a professor or a teacher, or a linguistics professional or translator. Otherwise, you can honestly get through pretty much anything at the B2 and C1 levels of English, but I'll still show you what it takes to get to C2 if you want to go there. Let's start with vocabulary. Now, at the B2 level of vocabulary, you should be very familiar with vocabulary that pertains to common things in life, such as work, school, and travel. At the C1 level of vocabulary, you should be able to understand more abstract and academic terms in higher education. And at the C2 level of English vocabulary, you should be able to understand English pretty much on the same level, if not at a higher level than most native speakers. Now, at the beginner levels, it was a lot less complicated to improve your vocabulary as you would just acquire new words. And as you acquire new words, your vocabulary would become more vast. But at the upper intermediate level, it's not just about learning new vocabulary words, but it's more about being able to actually apply them in the correct context. Now, if you want to go from the B2 to the C1 or C2 levels of English vocabulary, you're going to need to expose yourself to a much broader range of topics in English media. At the B2 level of English, I believe that you should be able to guess what most of the new words you come across mean based on the context by which they are delivered. As you can guess what these new words mean, you can acquire them into your active and passive vocabulary. The way that you're going to do this is by consuming English media. I would recommend using a platform such as YouTube because it has content about pretty much any topic that you could possibly think of. Now, when you're consuming English media, you can do it with or without subtitles, but the key here is that you can acquire new English vocabulary words and expressions in a more natural and a little bit more of an effortless way. By doing this consistently, your level of vocabulary will eventually get to the C2 level of English. But you will also need to know how to actually use it, which leads to the next skill, which is grammar. Now, at the B2 level of grammar, you should at least be able to understand more complex sentences with conditional clauses in it. A C1 level of English grammar will probably deal with more advanced passive clauses. And at the C2 level of grammar, it'll probably deal with more subjunctive clauses. Now, if you want to get your grammar from B2 to C1 or C2, you're going to need to read a lot. To be frank, most of the advanced grammatical rules in English will be a lot more applicable to written English as opposed to spoken English. Because the truth is, the overwhelming majority of native English speakers do not follow advanced grammatical rules in English when they speak. So, if you want to get your grammar to the C2 level and understand all of the advanced rules and how to apply all of the literary devices correctly as well, then you will need to read a lot of more advanced texts, which will typically be found in universities and higher educational institutions. You can also just find academic writing on the internet if you do a Google search. But more often than not, in academic writing is where you're going to find the most well written scripts in the English language. Again, I do not recommend pursuing the C2 level of English grammar if it is your goal just to be able to speak and communicate in English. But if you want to be a well rounded English communicator so that you can teach English to other people, or be a translator, or be a linguistics professional, then go for it. So now that you know how to improve your grammar, which is by reading, let's talk about the skill of reading. At the B2 level of reading, you should be able to at least understand what people are talking about in texts about familiar subjects and even texts about unfamiliar subjects. At the C1 level of reading, you should be able to understand many different interpretations of text about pretty much any subject, even if it's abstract. And at the C2 level of reading, you should be able to understand cultural nuances within the text that you're reading. Now, for the particular skill of reading, if you want to go from B2 to C1 or C2, it's actually more simple than the other skills. You just need to expose yourself to other media around the world in the English language. Most people will just read about subjects that are actually applicable to their lives. And that's what I would recommend to you guys as well. But if you want to pursue the C2 level of reading, then you should expose yourself to all different types of texts that you can read. Keep in mind that you do not necessarily need to read in the form of a book or an article online. You can also read subtitles from a more complicated discussion in a piece of media online. But now let's talk about a skill that is more complicated than reading, and that is listening. At the B2 level of listening, you should be able to understand most of what's being said about most subjects. At the C1 level of listening, you should be able to understand fast spoken English and about any subject. At the C2 level of listening, you should be able to understand fast spoken English about any subject with people who are using wordplay and in different accents of English. To be honest, I have not met very many people who are at the C2 level of listening as non native English speakers. But if you want to get to this level of listening, unfortunately, I don't really think that just listening to media online is necessarily going to be enough. If you want to go from the B2 to the C2 level of listening, you do not necessarily need to pack your bags and go move to a large multicultural English speaking city like New York or London. But you should absolutely get some experience communicating with native English speakers and non native English speakers around the entire world. You can do this remotely with any of the free language exchange applications online, but keep in mind it really will take a lot of time and experience to be able to understand English at this level. And this may sound harsh, but you actually do need a certain level of intelligence to be able to understand English at the C2 level. This is where it gets really complicated. Native English speakers can use expressions, literary devices, and words in very improper ways that are not correct at all. They could be using it this way in music, most popular in rap music. And sometimes native English speakers even just invent new words out of thin air. So, to understand formal, informal, commonly spoken, rarely spoken, and slang expressions and vocabulary words in English simply just takes a lot of experience communicating with native English speakers who speak much differently. Listening to English media online can help you improve your listening skills, but you will need some degree of experience interacting with real native English speakers if you want to get to the C2 level of listening. My simple advice for that is communicate with them online through a language exchange application or actually immerse yourself in real life if you can. Now let's look at how you can go from B2 to C2 in writing. At the B2 level of English, you should be able to write basic essays and basic emails. At the C1 level of English, you should be able to write more complicated and more robust essays and papers. And at the C2 level of writing, that's very sophisticated. That's being able to write books, academic articles, and things among that nature. Again, as mentioned earlier, most native English speakers are not at the C2 level of English for all of these skills. But if you want to go from B2 to C1 or C2 in writing, then guess what you need to do? You need to practice writing about more complicated subjects. A good way to do this is by observing very talented English writers and observing how they are so well written. By doing this, it could inspire your style of writing and it can trigger some creativity in your head as well. And this leaves the last skill, which is the most popular skill that everyone wants to be good at, and that is speaking in English. Now, at the B2 level of English, I would consider you a fluent English speaker who can converse about most subjects fluently. Maybe at the B2 level, you'll make some mistakes here or there when you speak, but native English speakers usually have a very easy time understanding what you're trying to say in any conversation. At the C1 level of speaking, you should be able to comfortably speak fluent about any topic that people bring up. And you should be able to do it spontaneously at any time, anywhere. And at the C2 level of English, you should be able to be very well spoken and well articulated about very complicated topics, form your own opinion about them, and explain them to people in a coherent way. If you want to go from the B2 level to the C2 level of speaking, you really need to work on your delivery of explaining things and just articulating things to people about literally everything. Now, to be at the C2 level of speaking does not necessarily mean that you need to use a bunch of complicated and advanced vocabulary words when you speak. But it does mean you should be able to apply a wide range of vocabulary and do it in a coherent way. Some of the best speakers I've ever seen explain things in an extremely simple manner, and it's effective. But they are also capable of explaining it in more complicated ways if they need to. For this skill, you will also need a degree of life experience to be able to express things in a certain way about certain subjects that you might not be familiar with. At the C2 level of speaking English, even if you don't know anything about a particular subject, you should still be able to explain and describe coherently why and how you do not know anything about that subject. And you should also be able to consistently pronounce words properly like a well spoken native English speaker would. Again, most native English speakers cannot pronounce every single word correctly. Most native English speakers are not at the C2 level of speaking, and they are not that articulate. So keep this in mind for all 6 of these skills. Only pursue the C2 level of English if you just really want to see how good you can become at English, or if you actually want to teach this to other people or be a translator or a linguistics professional. I can't really think of any other reason why you should pursue the C2 level of English. Now, if you're curious what your current level of English is, I have created a couple of English proficiency quizzes that will identify your exact level of English at each of the 6 skills. If you'd like to check that out, I'll leave a link to the website somewhere in the description or the pinned comment below. Also, leave a comment down below telling me what your native language is and where you're from. I would love to know. No matter what your level of English is, it's important that you know how to effectively study so you can actually improve your level of English. If you want to learn the easiest way to improve your English vocabulary fast, then be sure to watch the next video on the screen.